Take 14. Does this sound familiar? You're standing in the bike shop, politely listening to the mechanic explain that your anti-fluorescent disogenized spindle defector is broken and needs replacing. And maybe you're standing there asking WTF is that, and seeing dollar signs flash up in front of your face. Well, if you are, you're not alone, because that's what it can feel like standing there in the bike shop sometimes. And that's okay, we're not all World Cup mechanics and tinkerers. But what is not okay is being too afraid to ask about the little things on your bike. So today, we're gonna go through a handful of things that I think we're too afraid to ask sometimes, but are really simple and important to this push bike we have. All right, first piece of our puzzle is what makes this noise. Now, it's not rocket science, but it's a pretty cool piece of tech that without it, you wouldn't be able to descend like the hero that you are. And it's called our freehub. So where does that noise come from? Well, here. So for all intents and purposes, this is your freehub. And it's these teeth that make the ticking. As you descend, these are spinning and ticking over the notches on the inside of your hub. So for context, your cassette screws onto your freehub body here, and this sits into your hub on your rear wheel. Now, when you put all that power down that you have, you big unit you, these teeth spin faster than the notches do, and they engage and provide the power to that rear hub and power you forward like the champion that you are. Now, different brands do this slightly differently. Your freehub might not look exactly the same as mine does, but it's still important to keep this clean and lubed for all that movement that's going on in there. There you go, freehub 101. Next item on the menu is our headset. One of the most underrated items on our bike because how good is being able to turn? And it all comes down to these two bearings. So it's these two bearings that form your headset. And really your headset is the join between your frame and your fork. The headset cups sit in the frame, the bearings sit in the cups, then your bearings sit against this part of the fork. So what is a bearing? Often when we're talking about push bikes, it's a sealed cartridge bearing. So there's an outer race, an inner race, a retainer, and then a bunch of little ball bearings that allow things to turn or pivot. When filled with mud, water, and grime, it's these little balls that fill up and become hard to roll around, giving you that feeling of either fully seized or just clunky and slow to move. So it's important to keep these little guys clean. Finally, when you're putting it all back together, it's this little nut called your star nut that keeps the whole headset together. Now, full disclaimer as well, that not all headsets are alike, so when you take yours apart, or the bike shop does, it might look a little different to this one. All right, moving right along to the downstairs of your bike, AKA the bottom bracket or BB. Now you probably hear a lot about that, but what exactly is it, and when do you know that you actually need it replaced, or just to maintain it? So just like your headset, your bottom bracket is two bearings, and they provide the join between your pedals and your frame. Now because the bottom bracket's at the bottom of your bike, it gets filled with mud and water and just general crap. So it's important to keep an eye on it to make sure all those horsepowers you're putting down are getting transferred into that drivetrain of yours. So to do that, you need to take your cranks off. I can do mine with an Allen key, yours might be a little different, but then just run your finger around these bearings. If they're running smooth, you're good to go. If they're running a bit clunky or slow, then maybe it's time to take it to the bike shop to see if it needs replacing. All right, moving to the fancy stuff, your rear suspension. Sorry to your hardtail users, but I get the question a lot of how do I take my rear shock out? Now it's quite a daunting task, but it's pretty simple. So let's dive in, take the shock off, and show you a trick that you can do just to keep your bike running a little smoother between visits to that bike shop. Every bike model will have a different shock size. That's because of the different suspension platforms between bikes. And they will also have different mounting hardware. That's these little bits, and they'll be different between each bike as well. So for example, mine is a 20 and 10mm gap, while the Grim Donut has a 6 to 9mm gap. Now unfortunately, you can't find this hardware in the hardware store. Your local bike shop will be able to help you find the right parts if they need replacing. So a little trick when your shock is out, to give your bike a little bit more life, is to look after your frame bearings. They're very similar to your bottom bracket and headset like we talked about before, but they have a very limited scope of movement. So when the shock is out, you can actually cycle them through a much bigger range of motion, and that'll move the grease all the way around that sealed cartridge again. Give those bearings a little bit more life. A little trick when you're taking your shock out is be ready for the frame to fall backwards. Always take your rear wheel out, and you don't want to put any scratches in your nice fancy bike. Our final item on the menu today are our brakes. arguably the most important component on your bike. So it's important to know how they work and when you need to actually work on them or do a brake bleed. So, hydraulic brakes 101, when you pull the lever, oil moves down a line that pushes out these pistons. These pistons move brake pads closer together, which touch your rotor, and in theory, slow you down. So how do you know when you need to bleed your brakes? In a perfect world, when you squeeze your lever, it pushes oil down a line that extends these pistons. These pistons push your brake pads together onto a rotor, which in theory slows you down. But what can often happen over time, because you're riding your bike so damn much and you're descending so fast, is that oil can either become contaminated or air can get into the system. Now you've probably heard your mechanic or mate say that you've got squishy brakes or something to that effect. That's when you know you need a brake bleed. What a bleed will do will replace the oil, just like in your car, with fresh, uncontaminated oil, meaning that when you pull the lever, the pistons move the same amount. The other thing that gets bandied around a lot in the world of braking is to not squeeze your brakes when the wheel's off. Now what's going on there is that if you squeeze that lever, the oil moves down, pushes the pistons out, and it pushes them out too far, and they can't retract back into the caliper. That's this part that attaches to the fork. So if that happens, and you're lucky, make sure you take your brake pads out because you'll mess them up, push them back into the caliper. But if you've done a real bad job, you're going to need to see that local bike shop for a full reset back and a nice brake bleed. Now there are plenty of videos on how to bleed your brakes, so feel free to give it a crack at your own time. Best of luck to you. So there it is, a handful of things you might have been too afraid to ask about your bike. I'm sure you'll let me know what I missed in the comments, please do, and subscribe to the channel, I dare you, because I might even have some other Tom's Top Tips up my sleeve. Now thanks for watching, and go out and ride your bike.